Good morning, friends. Today we're celebrating the festival of St Alban, who's the patron saint of the liberal Catholic Church throughout the world. So different churches have different patron saints, and they can have more than one patron saint. In our particular chapel, our patron saint is St Michael. But the liberal Catholic Church overall is under the protection, guidance and inspiration of St Alban. And so today we celebrate St Alban, and that's why we have the colour red, because we invoke a lot of the power of the Holy Spirit when we're having these celebrations. So a very quick history on St Alban. St Alban was a Roman in England, as well, we know it as England, but during the Roman Empire. And his name wasn't Alban, it was Albanus or something like that. And he had a servant. He was a senior official in the Roman administration. He had a servant who was a Christian. And at that particular time, there was a purge on any Christians. And so any officials, particularly officials, had to, as we say in Australia, dob them in, had to tell the officials, people who were looking for the Christians, that he had some Christians there. Anyway, he suddenly had a revelation, and it probably coming for some time. He would have observed their particular piety, they were servants of his, and he would have seen their level of genuineness, one presumes, and they impressed him sufficiently that he did not tell the authorities about them, but protected them. However, the authorities eventually found out, and so he was martyred in the place that's now called St Albans in the UK. So that's the story of that particular individual. So when we hear these stories, we sort of wonder, I wonder if we could do that. I wonder, have we got that sort of ability? Have we got that courage? Well, of course, the answer is we don't know until we're actually confronted with the situation. But the point that should be made very, very strongly, and especially in this day and age, where we have religious fanatics of all description, of all faiths, have religious fanatics. This is not the rule of God. These people are not following God's laws. This level of fanaticism, which we see demonstrated, is not part of God's law. The martyrs have something altogether different. The martyrs have an inner conviction, an inner strength that take them through the experience of giving up their life. And so when we read about, particularly in the Epistle and the Gospel, when we read about the teachings from Jesus, he says, if you want to follow me, give everything up and follow me. Even give up your life. We must be very careful the way we interpret this. What this is talking about is a level of commitment and understanding. You'll recall that Jesus said to his disciples on more than one occasion, you need to have faith to have things happen. There was one occurrence which is recorded very close to the passage that we read of in the Gospel, where there was a father of a son. The son was possessed by a demon, using the language of the day, and the father approached Jesus and said, your disciples can't heal him. And Jesus said, and turned to his disciples and said, I'm paraphrasing, you guys need to get your act together. You've been through this experience once, and I gave you power, so you operated from my power. Now you have to operate from your power. And what is that? It's the power from the Father, which you have in proportion to your faith. What does that mean? And Jesus went on to say that if you had even the faith as tiny as a mustard seed, which is very almost like talcum powder, if you had faith of that sort of magnitude, you could move a mountain from here to there. So if we're thinking superficially about this, we think, well, wait a minute, I believe all this stuff. I believe in God, and I believe in Jesus and so on. You then have to go a lot deeper than that to understand really what is it that you are believing in. So we've had these sorts of discussions before, and I point out, as I'll point out now, that we live in the 21st century, and we put our faith in lots of things. We put our faith in electricity, that when we turn on the switch, the light's going to come on. And when it doesn't come on, what's our reaction? Our reaction is not, well, it was a miracle beforehand, so I need to find out what's stopping the miracle. No, our reaction is we grumble. We say, look, we've had this before, we take it for granted. But electricity is such a relatively new thing. Before, if we wanted illumination, it was candles or kerosene lights. And they were a lot of trouble. When we think about scientific theories, the scientific community tends to call them laws. And I think that's maybe a little bit misleading. I think what they are really propositions that seem to work okay. That's a bit of a mouthful, so they call them laws. But if we do have these scientific principles and we call them laws, we actually have the same reaction to them as putting our faith in something. So we learn about gravity. And if you've forgotten when you learnt it when you were a small baby, maybe on the top of some stairs, putting your foot tenderly over the step and wondering what happens next. Well, you found out what happened next. And the experience gave you the faith of gravity. So that sort of process is what I'm talking about. If we have the same absolute trust that we have in gravity, and we've got absolute trust in gravity, you cannot convince anyone on earth that there is not a thing called gravity. People will not believe you, and you believe it as well. If you had that same level of belief in the Father within, the Christ within, and the connection with what you can do through their power, with the same conviction as your belief in gravity, well, then you can move mountains. So it's an exercise of actually being realistic with yourself and really getting to the bottom of what you actually believe in. So what St Alban actually believed in, when it came to the ultimate sacrifice, he sided with his Christian servants and his life was taken. So we don't celebrate that act. We celebrate the example that St Alban has given us. If you have faith of the same magnitude as me, then you really are in alignment with God's law, and you will naturally then follow the correct thing to do. In the epistle we had this morning, which Wendy read, from the Book of Solomon, it's a lovely set of readings. The Book of Solomon, scholars think, was assembled roughly about the 1st century BC in Alexandria. Alexandria was where a lot of the fragments of what we call the New Testament were being brought together. Scholars think they were brought together then. So it wasn't actually connected to the sort of Solomon that we see in the movies necessarily, but it was all brought together from a translation, brought in one particular translation, scattered around different readings. But in this book we recognise and we can see the wisdom, and we wonder, what's the difference between wisdom and knowledge? Well, if Solomon was here, he would say, wisdom is the perfection of knowledge. Wisdom is when knowledge is perfected to the extent that you really understand it, and so then can lead a righteous life. A righteous life is a life in alignment with God's law. So if we just take a quick link back then to the way that St Alban conducted himself, we called him St Alban before, how he conducted himself, he had sufficient faith and an understanding that carried him through that experience. And that's the example to us. We've got the knowledge of what happened. Have we got the wisdom which really comes from an opening of the heart and arises from knowledge from God, knowledge from the Christ? That's the wisdom. That's the basis of faith, the perfection of knowledge. So these concepts are relatively easy to understand intellectually, I think, the difference between the things. The point is, this is an emotional journey. We spend a lot of our time in our emotions. We talk about having different bodies sometimes. If we have an esoteric view of what our personality is, we might say we've got a mental body or we've got an emotional body. And we can see our physical body, so that's not esoteric. Every time we stub our toe, we get reminded that we've got something physical. But if you look at yourself, or you just reflect on where your mind is most often, your mind most often is in your emotions. So that's where we tend to spend most of our time. We're evolving into intellectual beings more and more. We're much more intellectual than our Middle Ages brethren, much more intellectual than the people who wrote the words in the New Testament, much more intellectual than the people before Christ. That's the part that's evolving. Every part of us evolves. All of our personality evolves. But while we're in the emotional body, it needs to have an impact there to change our life. So if we're going to go on this journey, as we must as Christians, of developing faith, it must be felt in the emotional body to get motivated. That's just the facts of life for us. That's just the way things are at the moment. We can intellectually understand it. We might be able to perfect it by wisdom, and then it needs to come from the emotions to be galvanized by love. Galvanized by love. So there we are. This is not a sermon about how to become a martyr. This is a sermon about how to develop sufficient faith so that you can face every challenge in life. Every challenge in life with equanimity and a deep conviction that you're in the right place at the right time. That's faith. So I'll leave these thoughts with you on this particular festival of the patron saint of our church worldwide. And I commend in your thoughts, prayers and meditations these ideas that we've talked about this morning.